We'll move straight to the main item, which is the review of the criteria for the appointment of the Chief Constable of the PSNI. So we're waiting. At our meeting on the 30th of January, we considered letters from the Department of Justice advising that the Minister had decided to change the minimum criteria for appointment of the Chief Constable of the PSNI and providing information on the legislative framework and the mechanism to make the change, and agreed to request the attendance of the Minister to discuss the matter. Both the Minister and officials are here today. Relevant papers were issued to members at the end of last week, and also a Hansard of the oral evidence session with officials that took place on the 10th of October. Last year, the Department has also provided a copy of correspondence dated 30th of January this year to the Northern Ireland Policing Board, providing a copy of the revised draft determination in keeping with Regulation 46 of the Police Service of Northern Ireland Regulations 2005. And the Minister has requested any representations from the Police Board by the 10th of February. A copy of that correspondence was emailed to members yesterday and is in your table to pack. So, having said all of that, let me welcome the Minister for Justice, David Ford, Anthony Harbison, Director of Justice Delivery, and Karen Pearson, who is Deputy Director of the Reducing Offending Division from within the Department of Justice. And I'm sure you'll be aware it'll be recorded and published on Hansard. So, Minister, first of all, can I thank you at very short notice making yourself available to the committee today for us to be able to have this discussion. Obviously, you did have early discussions with us back in October last year around this particular issue, and members were keen that we would have an opportunity to discuss with you as you now deliberate on the next steps. So let me hand over to you now at this point, and then members, I'm sure, will have some questions.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. And as you've already done the introductions, Anthony and Karen, I don't need to do those. But thank you for providing me with the opportunity to respond to some of the issues that have been raised in relation to the review of the criteria for the appointment of the next Chief Constable. I'm assuming that at this stage, through a combination of the committee's consideration of the issue back in the autumn time, my comments in the Assembly and in the media over the course of the last week, the committee members will be familiar with the background to this issue. If members have questions in relation to the background, I'll be happy to go into more detail during the course of the meeting. But for now, Chair, I thought it would be more helpful to identify a number of the questions which have been posed around this issue over the course of the last week and to provide answers to each of them. The first question is whether the Minister of Justice has the power to alter the statutory minimum criteria for the appointment of a Chief Constable. The answer to that question is straightforward. The Minister's powers are set out at Regulation 11 of the PSNI Regulations 2005, which state that no person shall be appointed as Chief Constable of the Police Service unless he holds or has held such rank in such force and for such period as the Minister shall determine in respect of such an appointment. A determination by me would issue in accordance with Regulation 46 of the PSNI Regulations 2005. No other legislative process is required to give effect to determinations. The second question is whether in making this decision I've somehow interfered with or in some way diminished the role of the Policing Board. The Policing Board has and will continue to have primacy on the appointment of a Chief Constable. That is enshrined in Section 35 of the Police Northern Ireland Act of 2000, which clearly states that the Board shall, subject to the approval of the Minister, appoint the Chief Constable. So my powers are strictly limited to determining any minimum criteria and to giving final approval to whichever candidate the Policing Board selects at the conclusion of a recruitment process. Rather than interfering with or diminishing the role of the Board, my intentions are aimed solely at enabling the Board to have more latitude, and I remain entirely respectful of the Board's primacy. My proposed amendments are to the existing minimum criteria. The Policing Board will continue to have the ability to consider whether and the extent to which service in another force at ACC level or above is important, and to incorporate this into the selection process for the post as it deems appropriate. It will also retain the authority to stipulate other required skills, qualifications or experience over and above these minimum requirements. The third question appears to be whether I have carried out the appropriate level of consultation before reaching my decision. The answer to that question is that I have, in fact, gone considerably beyond the requirements of the legislation. The statutory requirement is simply that I issue a draft determination to the constituent bodies of the PSNI, these bodies being the Policing Board, the Chief Constable and the Staff Association, and that I consider their responses before issuing a final determination. We are at that stage of the process at present. But in addition to fulfilling this requirement, When this matter was raised with me by the Policing Board, I undertook what in effect was a process of pre-consultation, not just with the statutory consultees, but also with your committee. I also sought the advice of the Equality Commission, not least because the Policing Board asked that I fully explore and assess the potential equality implications of the existing requirement that applicants have served 2 years as an ACC or above in another UK police force. A fourth question has been whether, by announcing my intention to issue a new determination, I have somehow compromised the process for filling the Chief Constable's post upon his retirement in September of this year. I'm absolutely clear that the process for filling that post has not commenced. While I'm advised that the Chair and Chief Executive of the Board have discussed between themselves the question of how that process should be initiated and undertaken, my clear understanding is that no meetings of either the Board or its Business Committee have been held to discuss the matter, and that the criteria will not be presented to the Board for its approval until its March meeting. Providing that I am not delayed by others, my responsibilities will have been concluded well in advance of that. A related question is whether, in light of the Chief Constable's announcement, I should have delayed any new determination until after the process of appointing his successor had been concluded. My answer to that is that nobody suggested during the lengthy process of pre-consultation that this matter should not be finalised one way or the other until after the next Chief Constable is appointed. The rationale for reducing the minimum criteria, in my mind, being very strong, and given that the process of appointing a successor is not yet underway, I remain very firmly of the view that the best time to do the right thing is as soon as possible. Yes. Why wait 5 years to address what I am satisfied is an equality issue? The only reason for doing so would be if the competition were already underway, which is not the case. Much better, in my view, to move now. A final question relating to the substance of my decision rather than the process is whether my decision to lower the minimum criteria relating to 2 years' service at ACC level or above in another force from essential to desirable is the right one. My response, Mr. Chairman, is that I continue to believe that it is. Upon consideration of a number of possible changes and the feedback received, I believe that it will be anomalous to retain a provision which has been removed in England and Wales. I have tried wherever possible to maintain equivalence in terms and conditions between the various UK jurisdictions. My conclusion was further informed by concerns that the requirement for 2 years' service outside Northern Ireland may impact unfairly on certain groups, for example, females, those with dependents or a disability. These comments, Chair, appear to me to cover the most significant questions that have been raised over the course of the last week. If there are others, or if members wish to go into the issues that I've covered in greater depth, I'm of course happy to oblige. But in summary, I believe my decision is the right one, that I have acted within and in accordance with the powers given to me in statute, that I have consulted more deeply and more widely than I was required to, that my decision in no way undermines the role of the Board, indeed it enhances it, and that if concluded in the timescale that I intend it to, it should not cause any disruption to the process that the Policing Board will have to follow in recruiting a successor to the current Chief Constable. Throughout this process and in my final decision, I am keen to ensure that the exercise of my powers in defining the statutory minimum criteria for the post is carried forward in a way which resolves the potential discrimination that has been highlighted through the process of pre-consultation. I'm also resolute that it is for the Policing Board as the employer to define the skills and experience required of our next Chief Constable. While I have moved to remove unnecessary barriers to the candidate pool, the Board is of course free to add to the minimum criteria as they deem appropriate, including the requirement for service outside the PSNI. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for that opening statement. Let me ask just a couple of questions and I'll bring members in. First of all, in terms of the post of Chief Constable, how important is that position in terms of, from your perspective, and how the public would regard the Chief Constable? Can you outline to me how significant a post you believe the Chief Constable to be?
I suppose all one can say is it's the most significant post within the PSNI.
How significant do you believe it is that the Chief Constable is regarded as independent?
It's clearly extremely significant.
And in terms of the relationship with the Justice Minister, how important is it that the role of Chief Constable is both actually independent and perceived to be independent?
Again, that is clearly important. I mean, the importance is not just the relationship between the Chief Constable and the Minister, but also the relationship between the Chief Constable and the Board and the Minister. There is a complex tripartite set of arrangements.
And what would you regard the consequences to be for a Chief Constable if he or she was perceived to be an appointee of the Minister?
I would think in the context that the Chief Constable is clearly an appointee of the board, that would be unlikely to arise, but it would clearly be potentially damaging if it were perceived that there had been interference by the Minister in the role of the board.
And do you regard your interference in terms of changing the criteria as in any way creating a problem for the next Chief Constable in terms of how they may be perceived?
Well, I'm sorry, Chair, I reject the premise of that question entirely. My responsibility in terms of setting the minimum criteria is absolutely clear in statute. That is not interfering with the role of the board. If I were trying to tell the board what criteria they should apply, that would constitute interference. Reducing the minimum criteria is entirely within my remit. It is then for the board to determine the actual criteria.
Well, you rejected, but in the Assembly last week during question time, you said that you've no reason to apologise to the Deputy Chief Constable for a process that began with correspondence between the Department and the Policing Board in May last year, of which the Deputy Chief Constable was aware. My changes would enable the Deputy Chief Constable to be appointed Chief Constable. Do you think that comment was helpful?
That comment was in response to a specific question about the current Deputy Chief Constable, and I responded to the specific question in the way it was raised. The fact is, it's been made absolutely clear by the Deputy Chief Constable that she is not and was not intending to apply for the role of Chief Constable, so it's not a particularly relevant point. But in the context of responding to the question, I responded to the question.
Would it not have been better to have said the Deputy Chief Constable, like anybody else, would be able to apply and subject to due process if deemed on merit to be the best candidate, could then be appointed?
Perhaps I naively assumed that people would believe that I was expecting due process to take place.
Surely of a very significant post, the most significant within the police service, the Justice Minister would want to make sure that in no way could you be perceived or indeed actually be regarded as having anointed somebody, which to me, if you read what you stated in the Assembly, would very clearly point to you wanting to suggest the Deputy Chief Constable could be appointed Chief Constable.
No, in the context of being asked a specific question about an apology to the Deputy Chief Constable, I made it absolutely clear that there was nothing to apologise to the Deputy Chief Constable about. In the practical reality, that the Deputy Chief Constable had already resigned and was making it clear that she was not interested in the post, which has been confirmed publicly. I don't see how it could be construed in any way as suggesting that somebody who wasn't interested in the post was the preferred candidate.
Well, you didn't say that last week. Do you regret that you didn't put all those caveats in that I think Justice Minister should have put in, that it would be subject to due process?
Well, if people wish to start assuming the worst intentions on my part, then perhaps I should put in caveats to everything I say. I hadn't assumed that that was necessary in responding with a straight answer to a straight question.
But surely, Minister, you were aware of the public debate that the Chief Constable had announced his resignation. Candidates were already being identified as potential individuals given the current criteria, and others were being identified as being excluded because of the two-year rule criteria. In the middle of that public debate, you make an intervention and you state in the Assembly the Deputy Chief Constable could now be appointed Chief Constable without any caveat to do with due process.
No, sorry, Chair, I didn't make an intervention. I responded to a question. And frankly, if the Department of Justice was run on the basis of speculation in the media, we'd be in a very difficult position across a whole range of issues.
Surely you regard your proposed changes to the minimum criteria as an intervention?
No, it is carrying out my statutory function.
An
intervention is intervening in somebody else's responsibilities, not carrying out mine.
At a time whenever there's public debate about who the next Chief Constable should be?
As I repeat, if we ran the Department of Justice on the basis of public debate, we'd be in a very difficult position.
You made the announcement without having formally carried out your duties under the regulations, which is to consult with three of the bodies, namely the Policing Board, the Staff Associations and the PSNI. Is your consultation exercise a tick box exercise?
No, it's not a tick box exercise. I mean, the reality was I had to produce a draft of a determination, which was an indication of the process that I was intending at that stage on the basis of the informal pre-consultation, which, as I've said, was wider than that which I was statutorily required to do. So on that basis, it would have been a bit difficult to set out a draft determination without indicating what the direction of travel was.
You freely admit you're statutorily obliged to formally consult with those organisations, and you're doing that now once you've made an announcement that you believe this is what the criteria should be. So is it not indicating that you already have a closed mind on this issue, and surely you should have an open mind if a consultation is to actually mean anything?
No, because the statutory consultation is around a draft determination. Therefore, I have to set my mind as to what it should be. The informal pre-consultation had set the direction of travel, but you can't do a consultation on a draft determination without having the draft determination to consult on, and that is setting what the Minister's mind is. It doesn't mean it's a closed mind, but it does mean that there has to be something set down as the intention.
You make the comment that the pre-consultation set the direction of travel. At what point in the deliberations that you had with both this committee and the Policing Board did you get any indication that there was consensus around removing this particular criteria at this particular time?
There was no consensus in either this committee or the Policing Board, as I understand it, but that does not mean that there is not a ministerial responsibility to act as the Minister sees best. And in particular, there was very strong and significant guidance from the Equality Commission. So
why did you ultimately decide to do this? Who indicated to you, out of all of those bodies you had pre-consultation discussions with, that this should be done? What organisation or what individual said?
As I've just said, the Equality Commission gave strong guidance that there were significant potential equality issues in the way the guidance, in the way the determination currently stands, and their recommendation was to change the determination in line with the changes which had happened in England and Wales. If there is no justification for service outside another force in England and Wales, where it is much easier for people to move, then it is questionable whether the best equality interests are served by maintaining such a process within Northern Ireland, where movement for some candidates would have been significantly more difficult.
So, just to be clear for the record, the Equality Commission said make the change, but did the Police Board say make the change?
I think the record will establish I've already said that there was no consensus in either the Policing Board or this committee.
Was there any individuals from within the Policing Board, either as serving PSNI officers or membership of those bodies, both in this committee and on the Policing Board, and serving officers who said remove this barrier?
There was no specific suggestion from either the Staff Association or the Policing Board or this committee. If I remember correctly, the Chief Constable's advice was of support for adhering to the same arrangements as apply in England and Wales. Correct.
When was that indicated? When did the Chief Constable indicate that the change should occur?
I don't have that exact date in front of me, but if the committee wishes, I can supply the date that was conveyed.
The point that some people make is whether you agree or disagree with what you would want to happen, and I think people can argue either way on this. The timeliness of it is something that people who, even if they agree with you, are saying is inappropriate, because there was an announcement by the Chief Constable to resign, and you then decided at that point to go public and pursue this draft determination. Do you not feel it would have been better for this to have been consulted upon and a decision taken out with any discussion about who the next Chief Constable may or may not be?
Well, you say I decided to go public when the Chief Constable announced his intention to resign. The reality was this issue has been in discussion between the Department and the Policing Board since May of last year. The informal consultation happened in the autumn of last year. So it was well known that it was underway by all those who were involved in the process. I certainly didn't expect the Chief Constable to make the announcement at the point when he made his announcement. The expectation would have been that he would have been giving 6 months' notice from March to September, not announcing his intention to not seek an extension to his contract in January. But the timescale was already underway. The informal consultation having been carried out, for the consultation to then happen formally around the draft determination.
Okay, thank you. Mr McGuinness.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for coming. This is a very sensitive issue, the appointment of a Chief Constable. It's one of the most sensitive positions in public life here in Northern Ireland. And yet it would appear that you acted unilaterally in relation to the change or the proposed change in minimum criteria. On reflection, would you not concede that was not the best way to proceed in relation to trying to create change, however meritorious that change might have been?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how you interpret the phrase acted unilaterally, but if by that you interpret it as the Minister carried out the functions which statute says are the Minister's in order to provide the maximum possible freedom for the Policing Board to exercise its functions, then yes, I did act unilaterally, because that is my role, and it was as part of a process which was clearly not unilateral because of the involvement of wider and deeper pre-consultation.
Well, you accept it was unilateral?
In the context of carrying out the duties which statute puts on me, yes.
Yeah, and you had to some extent tested the waters by a pre-consultation commencing last May, and indeed involving this committee, not just the Policing Board, but this committee in October of last year. So you knew you knew at least that the Policing Board had considered this informally, perhaps not formally reaching a decision, but you knew that there was an emerging consensus that there should be no change, did you not?
No, I didn't know there was an emerging consensus there should be no change. There was no consensus report either in the board or in this committee.
I would suggest to you, and you can contest this, that there was a consensus on the Policing Board that there should be no change.
Well, then the situation is very simple, because my determination changes the mandatory minimum criteria. If there's a consensus in the Policing Board that there should be no reduction, if you put it in those terms, to the criteria, then the Board can set whatever criteria it wishes. Indeed, my understanding, although you'll appreciate I wasn't involved when Matt Baggott was appointed, was that there was a decision which set the criteria higher than the 2 years in another UK police force at ACC or above, for that appointment. So if there is no consensus in the Board, then no change will happen, because the Board will set the criteria. I merely change the mandatory minimum.
Can I put this to you, that I put it as colloquially as I can, there's no appetite in the Board, or certainly as I could see amongst this committee, for any significant change in relation to the criteria. And yet you took a decision, which I believe is unilateral, and I think others may also support that view, to try to effect a change despite the fact there was no real political appetite for that to happen at this time.
No, the only change which I am effecting is to reduce, if you put it in those terms, the mandatory minimum criteria.
Yes.
It is entirely up to the Board, and if the Board wishes to maintain the current level of mandatory minimum or enhance it, that is entirely the Board's prerogative, exactly as it should be. I am merely giving the Board discretion to do what it thinks best within a wider range than would have been the case otherwise.
But just reflect on what you've been saying to this committee. It seems to me that you haven't heard what the Chair has put to you quite robustly, that in fact you were creating a change where no change was desired and where there was no political consensus for that change to take place. and against the informal consensus that existed on the policing board. And in those circumstances, you were effectively out on your own.
No, I'm sorry, I wasn't out on my own. First of all, nothing was reported to me to suggest that there was any level of consensus against change within the policing board. And on the basis of the very specific equality guidance and the changes which have occurred in England and Wales, I believed that it was entirely appropriate, and it certainly was entirely within my personal responsibilities as Minister, to effect a change to the mandatory minimum criteria. But I entirely accept that the board has the power to set any criteria it wishes, whether at the new minimum level, at the old level, or enhanced above that level. So I don't see how my giving wider discretion to the board is anything other than allowing those who are responsible for making the appointment the widest possible discretion in how they apply their responsibilities.
Well, with respect, I don't think the policing board would see your actions as giving them a wider discretion. But
well, sorry, I
yes.
don't see how it can be not given them wider discretion. They are currently held to a standard of 2 years as an ACC in another police service, 2 years or more at ACC or above in another police service. That is being removed. It is up to them to apply the criteria that it wants. So it must be giving them more discretion on any rational meaning of the English language.
Can I ask one last question? You did say that the Equality Commission indicated to you that the sort of change that you're putting forward was something that might be desirable, if I can put it that way, on equality grounds. Did you share that advice with anybody outside the department?
I'm not conscious of that having been shared, given that that was a response by the Equality Commission at the same time as other people were also involved in the informal consultation.
Yes, but it wasn't distributed to the policing board, that advice or that response, if it wasn't, if you don't want to characterise it as advice.
Well, I don't believe. I don't mind how you characterise it. I don't believe that we shared responses, from any of the respondents with other respondents. No.
If they were willing to share that response, you would be willing to share that with the committee?
I'm quite sure if they're happy for it to be shared, there's no reason why it shouldn't be shared.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Mr. McCartney.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Minister, for your answers to date. In terms of how this was presented to the public and the public commentary which is followed, is there anything that you would do differently if you had to do this tomorrow?
I don't see any reason why I should consider doing anything differently. I believe by engaging in the early pre-consultation wider and deeper than I was required, that was a positive demonstration of engagement with people. I believe I took the appropriate advice where it came from the Equality Commission, and in the absence of consensus elsewhere, in either the board or the committee to the contrary, I believe it's appropriate that I should move to give that greater discretion to the committee, which I propose to do.
No, I mean,
sorry, to the board.
No, I accept that, but I'm asking you in terms of the public controversy which has followed. Is there anything which you would do differently? I mean, and I'd say that, prior to this, did any of your officials in the sort of pre-briefing say, is this the best way to do it? In times past, I mean, and I say this, that you've been very courteous in terms of, last year when you were making a few amendments to a minor bill, that you asked to speak to myself and the chair and told us that you were going to do it rather than present it to the public. Would you have not have considered perhaps either going to the policing board or meeting the committee or meeting the chair and deputy chair to say this is going out in the public domain and it might be controversial? No one said that to you in your briefing. This could be controversial.
Well, with respect, I don't want to get dragged into the issue what may have been said by officials, but I mean, I will answer that point. Nobody said to me that that point arose. I suppose I thought that the pre-consultation, as we're describing it, had actually covered that particular issue.
So there's no one gave you advice that this might play out in the public commentary that it could be controversial.
I'm saying I'm quite happy to say that nobody gave me advice that I should do anything further in terms of spreading that. I'm really not going to go into the issue of officials' advice any
I understand that point perfectly, that the people told you that what you were doing was within your gift. That's fine. I'm not disputing that at this time, but I'm asking you, did anybody say to you that if you do it in this particular way, or if we do it in this particular way, it will end up looking like it's going to be controversial? And the reason why I say that is, the department or its predecessor in the past have been accused of interfering in our processes. They have been accused in relation to the appointment of the second police ombudsman of interfering in the criteria midstream. So with that in mind, did no one say to you, perhaps you need to be careful how we present this?
Well, I'm not going into the detail of advice that was given. I am quite content that whatever the concerns you may have about my predecessors, I'm quite content that it was not necessary to do any further, informal consultation, given the informal consultation that happened last year, and certainly it is in the context where, on a number of occasions, I have spoken to both chair and vice chair in terms of issues coming up. I had not seen it as being anything other than giving a little bit more discretion to the policing board, in line with my responsibility, and had not seen it as necessary at that point.
And that opinion hasn't changed the way it's played out in the public. It's just what's all the fuss about?
Well, indeed, I could say what's all the fuss about. I mean, if
precisely, what is all the fuss about?
Well, I'm not sure what the fuss is all about, because I believe I've done my duties correctly.
Why is part of the public commentary that people are saying that there is interference, that this was done in a in a cack-handed way? Why are people coming to that conclusion if it's what's all the fuss about?
Well, I'm sorry, I can only say that I believe that those who are saying it's being done wrong and it's interference have been ill-informed about the process in which I've been carrying out my duties and giving wider discretion to the board, not narrowing its discretion. That would be interference.
No, but I mean, in terms of how this is played out, I mean, we've seen how it's played out. That no one or nowhere in your thinking was this is going to be controversial. Perhaps I should handle it a little bit better than the way I'm proposing.
I did not see a modest widening in the discretion of the policing board as being controversial. No.
Modest?
Modest, yes.
Right.
Because
at the time when this was brought in, I mean, we go back to the sort of formation of the PSNI. This would have been seen as a significant move, that the appointment of a chief constable would have to have served 2 years in an outside force. That would have been seen as one of the, if you like, one of the things that changed the perception of policing. So I don't think you can call it lowering that standard as modest. I think you're doing a disservice to the criteria in the first instance.
No, because the discretion remains with the board. The board has the discretion to set the criteria.
But you have stated your intention. You've stated your intention as Minister that it's no longer required. And they say that that's a modest change. I mean, I think it flies in the face of the reason why it was brought in the first instance. Because if it was a modest change, then why would people have always seen it significant? Why would you have said earlier on that in terms of Matt Baggett, which is the first time I knew that the criteria was actually heightened, they say more than 2 years? So it's not seen as modest. It's seen as a significant signpost in appointing Chief Constable.
No, because at the point when it was introduced for the PSNI, it was exactly in line with the position in England and Wales, and that position has changed. In the context of us seeking to maintain uniformity of terms and conditions as far as possible across the United Kingdom, I believe that was one reason why the issue should be looked at, and indeed that was the point that was raised by the policing board in May last year with the department. And in terms of allowing the policing board to set the appropriate criteria, I believe they now have the opportunity to set whatever they believe is appropriate, given that the PSNI is now a significant period on from when this was first introduced.
I mean, if it was as modest as that and as straightforward as that, then I think it begs the question why you didn't go and meet the policing board to say this, rather than a public pronouncement. From your point of view, people making a fuss out of nothing. If that wasn't predicted beforehand, then I mean, I think it was bad political judgment, or someone who's advising you who didn't say we need to be careful here. This might be misread from your point of view. would it not be better perhaps to go and announce this to the policing board rather than announce it to the public and then let everybody make up or pretend that this is controversial when it's not?
Well, given that there was no clear consensus in the policing board and there was no clear consensus in this committee, given that in October members of this committee were invited to make party submissions to the department and none did, I'm not sure how I'm expected to regard it as controversial.
Yeah, well, I mean, they think, well, the way it's played out actually proves that wisdom of yours is wrong. Because most people now, in relation to this particular appointment, will see it as controversial. There are people...
If I were to be controversial...
If I could just finish this point, and beyond the politics of it, if you like, because you can say people take party political positions and they do it for whatever reason, but many of the people who are following this, commentators, people who are interested in human rights and policing, are all saying that this now is nearly a flawed process, because people are saying that it was that the criteria was changed after Matt Baggett announced his resignation. Now, people can have their view or not the competition has started or not, but I mean, take it away from policing. If there's a football manager sacked this afternoon, the board of directors may not have met. They say we're going to appoint a new manager, but everybody immediately says the competition starts when the person resigns.
I don't see how in the case of a statutory body the competition can start when there hasn't even been any formal consideration by the board or its relevant committee.
It was very, very interesting. I mean, and if, when Matt Baggett announced his resignation, that the news programmes were filled with the potential candidates. So the mind of most people is when someone resigns, automatically people look to who's going to be the next chief constable. Whether the formal process has begun or not, in most people's minds the competition has begun. And for this criteria to be lowered in the way it was, I just think it was handled very, very badly. And I think, I'm not saying, I don't want to be blaming officials because that's maybe personalising it, but certainly if no one said to you prior to this, we need to be careful here, then I think in the future you should be mindful. In particular, when you have in the past, to your credit, have sought out the committee, and less controversial than this, they come and say, look, I'm going to propose a change and I want to give you the courtesy of telling you. I think you made a mistake in not doing it in this instance. So that's mine.
Okay, thank you. And Minister, you make the point that no parties made a submission to you. If you read Hansard on the 10th of October, Jim Wells outlines in absolute clarity the DUP's position in respect of this. Now, Jim might want to elaborate. He was next on the list to bring him in, but it was just to address that particular point.
Yes, I'm just thinking, you know, if this ever got to a court case, the facts of the aggrieved person would be as follows. You held an informal consultation. This committee said no. Certainly I remember, as the chair, making it very clear, making it absolutely clear that we were not prepared to accept this change. The policing board were unhappy. Then the Deputy Chief Constable resigns, and one of the reasons that she gives for her resignation is the fact that she was not, did not fulfil the criteria to become Chief Constable. You then announce a change in the criteria, and then you refer directly to that lady in an oral question to Mickey Brady. Now, I have to say, any reasonable person looking at that would believe that there's some indication that those series of events are related. And my difficulty with all of this is that if someone went for the position and didn't get it, and that went to court, I think there'd be very strong evidence to suggest that the whole process would be set aside as null and void. Now, surely a reasonable person outside your department looking at those facts would think that there's something not right here.
Well, I mean, just to take one minor point, you said I referred in a question to Mickey Brady. I referred in an answer to Mickey Brady's specific question about the current Deputy Chief Constable. It's a bit difficult to answer a question about the current Deputy Chief Constable without referring to her. But were I the person who made the appointment, you might suggest that there was some issue there. In the context where I merely set the minimum criteria, and it is up to the policing board to carry out the appointment process entirely, from setting the criteria to doing the shortlisting to conducting the interviews to making a decision. neither you nor I are employment lawyers, possibly for the benefit of society in both our cases, but I don't see how that could possibly be construed as any level of interference.
But, I mean, let's assume that your motivation was entirely as pure as the driven snow. Now,
Thank you.
I'm just saying, let's assume. Now, that being the case, did it never occur to any of the mandarins within the Department of Justice that even if that was the case, what you were about to announce, given those facts which you've accepted, that there may be a sort of a cloud hanging over the whole process? And nobody said, hold on, yeah, what you're doing is absolutely right, Mr. Minister, but be aware of how the public will perceive what you're doing. Did that never occur to anybody?
Well, so you're trying to pursue further down the line of questioning, which I didn't wish to go with the Vice Chair. I took the decision. It was my responsibility. It's not up to me to answer what advice I may or may not have received from officials.
Does this decision require any subordinate legislation?
No, a determination is simply a ministerial determination.
Well, I think you have the answer of our meeting the 10th of October. Given the fact that it was quite clear from that meeting that there was deep unhappiness with what you're proposing in this committee, and given the fact that the signals that were coming back from the board, the policing board, weren't particularly positive, regardless of what the nature of the decision, was it not awfully rushed? Given the fact that I would have thought you would have come back to this committee. And also, I mean, I've been a chair of a committee, I've been a deputy chair of a committee for many years, and even on very minor matters, ministers would call the chair and the deputy chair in for an informal private briefing. Now, I would have thought on something of the magnitude of this, that the very least that should have been done is Mr Given and Mr McCartney should have been called into a room and told, folks, I'm about to announce this, because the first anybody of this committee knew about it was when you stood to your feet. Was that proper procedure?
Well, given that formally the committee has no role in this, I believe the informal consultation, which happened last autumn, was giving the committee a place, and certainly a place which I would wish to give the committee, but a place which is significantly more than legislation prescribes for it.
Has the Deputy Chief Constable resigned? Am I right in thinking that that doesn't take effect to the end of March? That decision?
That is a decision between the Deputy Chief Constable and the Policing Board, but it's certainly my understanding she has indicated a definite intention to resign at the end of March.
Yes, I accept that, but my understanding is anyone in that position, I'm not referring to her specifically, but anyone in that position, if they announce their intention to resign, clearly there's a period before they go, and secondly, under what you're suggesting, there's nothing to stop someone who has gone coming back into the process and applying, isn't that right? They can come back in. The fact that they've resigned doesn't preclude them from coming back in to apply for Chief Constable.
I don't know what the exact terms are in that particular position.
Now, my understanding is that there was a management meeting in the Policing Board 3 weeks ago to discuss this issue. So the board had already, in effect, started the process of searching for a new Deputy Chief Constable and a new Chief Constable. Now, if it got to that stage, and if you were aware of that, why then make a decision to make the announcement when you did?
My understanding is different from yours. My understanding is that the meeting you refer to was a day or two before the Chief Constable announced his intention to not seek an extension and was purely to consider the question of the Deputy Chief Constable. So that's the information I've been given.
Right, so there was no discussion of anything else beyond that at that meeting?
Well, I don't know what was discussed, but at that point the Chief Constable had not indicated his intentions.
Now, if it became apparent, in fact, that you were not fully informed about what happened at that meeting, and there was a discussion in both positions, would that then not indicate that the process had started and what you were about to do had indeed interfered in what was going to happen?
Well, I don't see how that process could possibly have started. I mean, Mr McCartney makes the suggestion that when the Chief Constable announces his intention to terminate his contract, that the process had started. But
in the public mind?
In the public mind, yes. I mean, a point which I do not accept in technical terms, but Mr McCartney makes that point. But you're now trying to make the point that the fact that he might possibly not seek an extension had somehow started the process. And if I can't accept Mr McCartney's point, I certainly can't accept yours, I'm afraid.
Well, I think we need to refer back to the Policing Board and find out exactly what happened at that meeting, but the information I have is that it was much more all-embracing than you were led to believe. And again, if that was the case, there should have been alarm bells ringing in the head saying, hold on here, even if this is the right decision, it's the wrong time to make it. Timing's everything.
Yeah, but sorry, I still don't see how when the Chief, if if that occurred, as I understand it, before the Chief Constable had made his intentions known, I cannot see how any process could possibly have started. I mean, I've had a discussion with Mr McCartney about when the process started, but it certainly didn't start before the Chief Constable indicated his intentions.
We'll follow that up. I mean, as other members have said, well, just going to make just another point. Given the fact you've admitted you didn't inform Mr Given or Mr McCartney, I understand you didn't inform the chair of the policing board before you made this announcement either. That person, I think it's a lady, was totally flummoxed when she heard on the news that this decision had been made. Now, surely due process should have been an informal meeting with her and her deputy before that decision was made.
I don't know that a meeting was necessary. The fact is that the formal consultees were notified by email before the issue was made public. I have been told that there was a problem within the email system within the policing board, that although my email or the department's email was received at policing board headquarters, it was not communicated to members.
Well, I know with Mr Putz, the Health Minister, I'm on the Health Committee, and we are regularly summoned to his meeting to be informed privately, myself and Marie McLaughlin, about things which are of much less significance than this, because it is seen as being the proper way to do things, so that suddenly we don't get a microphone thrust into our nose saying, what's your view on this, and you know nothing about it. I wouldn't have thought an email on such an absolutely fundamental issue, which you define as modest widening. Well, I don't think there'll be too much support for that view in the community. But I would have thought, again, summing them up to your office at Stormont, maybe the day before, and saying, look, folks, I think you should know what I'm about to do, would have been the very least that should have been done, because this issue will dominate the policing board over the next 6 or 7 months. The replacing of these two crucial positions will absolutely dominate the work of the board, and for very good reasons, because, as you've admitted, these are absolutely crucial appointments. And I would say, for the future reference, I think you would need to do that with both this committee and the board.
Well, there are issues about the relationship between the department and the board. Certainly, I don't think the chair or vice chair would think I've ever summoned them to a meeting. We have invited the chair and vice chair to meetings on occasions, which have generally been productive. I repeat my point, in the context of a modest change in the minimum criteria, where the criteria will be set by the policing board and not by the department or the minister, I do not accept that the change is of the scale that you're suggesting.
I mean, I think we'll have to agree to differ on the phrase modest widening. The other issue, and I think it's absolutely crucial, if your officials didn't step in to advise you on how the public would perceive this, surely somebody should have stepped in as to if there's a possibility of you opening up the process to judicial review. And clearly, there's a view out there that what this series of events, which maybe entirely appear, as the Driven Snows has said, could be an indication of coordination and collusion between them. But somebody should have said, hold on here, this could leave the entire process ending up in the courts. Because clearly, an aggrieved person, given what's now out in the public domain, would have good grounds and certainly would get leave to appeal to judicial review. Was that taken into account?
Well, I have some very good officials in the department. I have no doubt, had anybody thought that we were liable to judicial review, I would have been so advised.
Well, I have to say this looks like a QC's charter, what's happened here, because...
Well, again, with respect, neither you nor I are employment lawyers, so let's leave it to those who are.
Thank you, Mr Chair.
All right, thank you. And I appreciate members indicating about whether I and the Vice Chair should have been briefed about this. I'm not precious about that. The Minister does talk to us on occasions when he deems it's appropriate. That's entirely a matter for the Minister. My reaction in dealing with this has nothing to do at all with feeling that my nose may have been put out of joint. So I don't want anybody thinking that that is the case. But the point's made, and obviously the Minister can decide when he wishes to deal with us or not. So I just want to make that clear. Mr Dixon.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for coming along and clarifying many of the issues. The answers to the questions which you raised at the beginning were very helpful for anybody who really wants to understand this particular process. Indeed, if you hadn't made the announcement which you made with regards to taking the matter further forward, would you agree with me that there might have been a great deal of speculation why back in May and October, when you did undertake the pre-consultation, that at the moment when the Chief Constable resigned, people might indeed be looking back at that point and actually wondering, if you'd said, I'm not making any changes, why you'd done the pre-consultation then not done any changes? And indeed, Mr Wells makes reference to what may be raised by way of judicial review. To do nothing could equally well have resulted in that as well, perhaps, given that you had undertaken a pre-consultation. People might wonder where that had disappeared to. Was there some black hole that you had created down which it might have disappeared? Well, also, I think members should take caution in terms of their recollection of things, particularly in relation to the Hansard of the consultation discussion which we had in the committee. And indeed, a couple of members raised very serious issues about the equality proofing of the process. And indeed, you've highlighted the value of that through at least one set of representations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I mean, just in terms of the speculation, if we hadn't gone ahead, I mean, I repeat the point. This issue was raised in the context of changes which were happening across the water by the board with the department as far back as May, and that was what led to the informal consultation. I think it is open to speculation as if things hadn't moved on, especially in the light of the quality guidance, what the position would have been. But in the light of that, then clearly it remains with the board to determine if they believe to maintain the existing minimum criteria or enhance them. It can certainly be, if they can satisfy themselves that there is not an equality issue on enhancing those guidance, then they are entitled to do so. But from my point of view, I believe it was appropriate to follow the advice that there would need to be good reasons, but good reasons will be determined by the board and not by me.
Just to ask members, there's some interference in the mics with mobile, so if they're not off, if you can at least keep them off the table, away from microphones, that would be helpful. Mr. Humphrey.
Thanks, Chair. Minister, can I thank you for coming at short notice. I only proposed on Thursday that you come to committee, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here. In relation to, I must say I don't agree with the point and the assertion that Mr. Dixon has just made in terms of the clarity. I think there are more questions and answers that still remain. But whatever the view of members around the table, and indeed your own view on this position and decisions that have been taken by you and your department, can I ask you, do you not accept that the timing of the remarks, the timing of the announcement, is just wrong? Because I took note of what you said. The process is not underway, and the right time is as soon as possible. But I actually do believe that whenever you made the announcement, or made the suggestion, or whatever it's going to be deemed as, that the hair was said at that point. And not only out in the public, but in the media. There's been febrile activity around that, and obviously also within the various police services across the United Kingdom as to who might well be the successful replacement candidate.
But the reality is the process, as far as my role is concerned, was underway when the policing board asked the department in May of last year, and when the consultation was carried out informally in the autumn of last year about it. As I said earlier, I was unaware of the timing in which the Chief Constable would announce his intention not to seek an extension, which was at the point when the draft determination was being drawn up. And when you talk also about issues across the various police services of the United Kingdom, I mean, I'm not sure how many people would be qualified under the current criteria, but it's something in the region probably of 140 or 150 officers. We're talking about a very significant number of people affected, and potentially very minor changes in the numbers who might be qualified for it. So I don't see that the speculation across the United Kingdom in policing circles is likely to be very significant. The real issue is whether I should be guided by what is happening when commentators, many of whom were unaware of the process that was already underway, choose to start discussing the issue. And as far as I was concerned, my duty was to carry forward the process properly, regardless of what commentators in the media were saying.
Well, Minister, I have to contest that from my perspective, my party's perspective, the real issue is actually whether we're going to have a fair, open, transparent process to recruit a new Chief Constable, and whether or not there will be confidence in that process. And, you know, can you, in giving evidence to this committee, honestly contend that the announcement that you made and the media speculation, which has been huge and considerable, has helped that process and will deliver a fair, open and transparent process that people have confidence in?
Well, I can't be responsible for media speculation on any of the many things that the Department of Justice is involved with. There is nothing in what I have done in terms of my formal duties and my responsibilities under the law which should in any way create any concerns about the fairness and transparency of the process.
In your opinion?
I can only state my opinion, but there is nothing which I have done which has been anything other than to carry out my statutory responsibilities and to enhance the role of the Policing Board.
And you don't believe the timing was wrong?
And the timing that I was engaged on was entirely appropriate, given that the issue was raised in the context of changes across the water by the Policing Board in May of last year and was carried through the informal consultation on a wider and deeper basis than was required, and which was being carried through to the process of a draft determination at the point when the Chief Constable announced he would not be seeking an extension.
And finally, Chair, do you not believe that in relation to advice that you sought and were given, that advice was naive, and the judgment, political judgment, was also naive and wrong in this whole process?
I believe that I took the decision as Minister, which was mine to take in accordance with the legislation, was appropriate, its substance and timing, and which will enable the Policing Board to carry out its functions properly.
Thank you. Thanks.
Mr. Elliott.
Chairman, thank you. Thank you, Minister. And, I'll not hold you because I have to get in for questions, so apologies I missed the start of it, but thanks for coming. Two very quick questions. One is, you did say that it is now up to the Policing Board to determine the criteria. All as you're doing is widening the process. Mm-hmm. Do you see any challenge, legal challenge in respect of that at all? And the second question, I'll just roll the two into the one. The way you made the announcement, and obviously the executive have called it in FM, DFM have called the issue in. Do you see that, or do you believe that you were right to make the decision on your own, or that it should have been a executive direction? Thank you, Chair.
I see no reasons for believing that there's any possible legal challenge to the process. What I have done is exercise my responsibilities and widen the opportunities for the board to make its best decision on criteria for the job as it carries out its role, which is fundamentally to appoint the next Chief Constable. In terms of the issue of the executive, I can think of many issues of significantly greater substance which have not been called into the executive. I'm not aware of any occasion, for example, that transforming your care, which affects every person in Northern Ireland, has been called in for discussion at the executive. I'm not aware that the common funding formula, which affects every child in Northern Ireland,
those aside, Minister, your particular decision, do you believe it should or shouldn't have been?
I believe, on that basis, I believe there is no reason why this should have been called in. I was happy to explain to ministerial colleagues last week the basis of my decision, but in the light of the sort of decisions which are left with departments, I believe that this was entirely appropriate in line with the legislation to be a ministerial decision within the DOJ.
You do accept it is, however, now an executive decision?
I accept that the executive has called, well, FM and DFM have called the issue into the executive, and I've given an explanation, and I've undertaken to report back to the executive.
But just to be absolutely clear, you're accepting that if a majority of members on that executive decide to retain the status quo, that is a binding decision of the executive, and you can't.
With the greatest respect, Chair, to you and the committee, my relationships with the executive are for discussion between me and the executive, not with this committee.
Well, I'm not wanting to predetermine, obviously, its outcome, but should the executive decide to retain the status quo, they don't accept your arguments, particularly about its timeliness, you accept that decision. You're not in a position to take any other decision other than what the executive will decide. From a purely technical, legal point of view.
I'll repeat the point. My relationships with the executive are a matter that I will be discussing with the executive.
But this is, Minister, with the greatest respect, this has nothing to do with your relationship and private conversations. It's a purely legal question. can you, as Justice Minister, decide to take a different decision contrary to what the Executive may decide when it meets to deal with this particular issue?
And I repeat, I will be discussing that issue with the Executive.
Well, Mr. Chairman.
Surely, Minister, you're in a position, or your officials have advised you, that the legislation empowers the Executive to call in anything that's deemed significant. That then makes it an executive decision as opposed to a ministerial decision of that particular department. Do you accept that that is legally the position that the Executive has now taken in respect of this particular issue?
I will discuss that issue with the Executive.
So you haven't got advice from officials to say you can take a decision on your own without recourse from the Executive?
I will not be discussing any advice I get from officials with this committee. I will be taking decisions on behalf of the department.
Very interesting response to that. Either you accept the Executive has got the legal authority to have called this issue in, which has now deemed it an executive decision as opposed to a Minister for Justice decision, or you don't. It's a simple yes or no. Is the Executive acting within its legal remit to have called this decision in, making it now an executive decision? Yes or no?
I will be discussing that issue with the Executive.
Okay, Minister, based on what you're saying, and clearly this is a particularly strong issue for you in terms of your relationships with the Executive, if you don't get your way, is this a resignation matter for you?
I think, Chair, you are now straying way beyond this committee's remit. With respect, I have come here, I've answered questions for an hour, as I said I would do. You are now way beyond the responsibilities of this committee.
Okay, well, we can ask. You don't necessarily need to answer, Minister.
Well, when you keep asking 5 times, it suggests you don't accept that.
Could I come in on this?
This is the very last question, and I appreciate that, Minister, you've been very generous with your time. Mr. Anderson had indicated, so very briefly.
I will be brief. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for coming along today at that short notice. Minister, I think you stated that you consulted widely in this. I think that was maybe something that was said. But
I'm not sure I said widely. I certainly said wider than required by statute and earlier than required by statute.
Beyond your requirement, is that what you're saying? Yeah. In that pre-consultation. But bearing in mind the consensus of this committee that we've talked about and the policing board, there was no consensus for a change. What was your driving force then behind going down this road with this wide consultation that you went beyond, you say? Where was the driving force to enact this change?
Well, I'm sorry, I was not given the impression there was any consensus in this committee or in the policing board. There was a very strong piece of advice from the Equality Commission that I needed to consider those issues, and this was on the back of the policing board having raised the issue in the first place because of changes to the equivalent regulations in England and Wales. And it was on that basis that I deemed it was appropriate to make the same changes in Northern Ireland as were happening in England and Wales.
So it's really on the equality aspect of it?
It's a combination of both.
Using as the main driving force?
It's comparability across the UK and the equality guidance. But to repeat again, I set the mandatory minimum criteria. The board will determine the actual criteria.
Yeah, well, say there was no consensus, I say, in the committee as far as I was aware, on within the policing board. But setting that aside, say we've covered a lot today, but and just quickly, would you not say that the process has indeed been tainted by what has taken place?
No.
Like even after today, and I think it was from across the way here, that you even went as far to say that those who see this as interference are ill-informed. Are you saying, as the Minister, that we are all ill-informed and everyone outside of this room are ill-informed? Is that what you're saying? That you were?
I think I was saying that
10% correct, and everyone else is ill-informed. Isn't that correct?
I think I was saying that in the context of the initial response in the media from people who were unaware of the pre-consultation, who were unaware of the distinction between my role as Minister and the role of the policing board. I think that was the context in which I used that term.
Yeah, well, you couldn't say that about fellow MLAs and things that we were not informed. And just finally, we've talked a lot today and went over a lot of ground here. But are you still adamant your decision was right? And on reflection, would you not change that decision? Would you still say the decision, the way you went about this, was right, and you do the same again?
I believe the decision was right. I believe the way I went about it, including the wider consultation over an extended period, was right as well.
And you do the same again?
I may well not be the minister to have the opportunity
But on
to do such a
reflection,
thing in 5 years' time.
on reflection, you're not saying
I would
you're
not- I
adamant
would not
or
change-
correct, but you would, on reflection, you would carry it out in the same manner again,
I would carry out what I have done
in the same way.
in the same manner, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, Minister, thank you very much for making yourself available to the committee. Thank you. Okay, members, there's no other business in respect to this particular issue. Mr. Humphrey?
Yeah, I just, Chair, I'd like to make a proposal. I start off by saying I very much appreciate the Minister coming, but at short notice, be decent of him to do so and give us so much of his time. But I believe, personally, I think it's the view of our party, and I agree with Mr. McGuinness, that the Minister acted unilaterally with regard to this issue. And whatever the Minister's stated view, I believe that it was the timing of his announcement and his decision was wrong and is naive. And I think, to be honest, there is a pending vacancy. We have a time period in when the Chief Constable is going to leave, and I think when the announcement was made, that did set the hair running. And I think the activity out there and speculation out there has started and will continue during that period. And I'm not sure that's good for the police, to be honest. But I think we have to have confidence in this process. It has to be seen to be fair and equitable and open and transparent. And I think this decision has potential to undermine that, in my view. Can I therefore suggest that, because it is an executive decision, can I suggest that this committee writes to every member of the Northern Ireland Executive, every minister, around this issue? And I also suggest that we should write to the Policing Board as well around this issue, because I just think that the general public, to ensure that confidence in the police is maintained and retained, the general public need to have confidence in this issue, and I think it has to be seen to be open and above board and transparent, and cannot be in any way tainted. And I would propose that a letter goes to every minister of the Northern Ireland Executive for their view on this decision, and also a letter should go to the Policing Board as well, because clearly they were not consulted, and I think they should have been.
Excuse me, members.
Mr. Chair, could I support what Mr. Humphrey has said? I think the relationship, I think we may have a vacancy for a Justice Committee Chair in a few minutes. Is he going to survive? Could I say that the relationship between the Executive and individual ministers was clearly established by the court case that was taken by the Minister of Finance at Christmas? I am worried, I must say I'm very worried by Mr. Ford's answer to your questions, Mr. Chair. There's almost an indication that he believes he still has carte blanche to go ahead without executive consultation. Now, that really would lead to a very, very difficult situation for all concerned. So therefore, I think it's very important we do establish that the executive parties have the final decision here, not just for this decision, but a myriad of others that have been called in, that ministers can't do solo runs. Our ministers or anybody else's ministers can't just go off and do that. So therefore, I think it's essential we get that off as quickly as possible.
Okay, members.
Okay, but what's the letter?
About?
What's the letter going to say? I mean, there's about three. We have no issue of recording that perhaps, that the committee would make the executive or whoever, the Policing Board, aware that we don't think this is the appropriate time to change the criteria. But they are executive issues. I think we send them a copy of Hansard rather than say, "Are you aware of your responsibilities?" Yeah. I'm not. We're going counter to what they're saying, but it's nearly as if we're saying to the executive, "We're watching you," syndrome. Maybe we are. But I've no issue around saying that the timing's inappropriate as we sit. you know, and please be aware of that as our opinion as a Justice Committee, and send it to both the Executive and the Policing Board. I have no issue with that.
Well,
Given
Although,
though-
I mean,
given
obviously,
though,
I'm
Chair,
talking for Stuart, you know what I mean?
Given though, Chair, the point that the process was started in good faith at a time when there was no matter under consideration at all, and we could just as easily be sitting here today demanding to know why the Minister didn't make any appropriate changes. But there you are.
Well, I think certainly, members, if you want to convey a view of this committee, certainly the Minister has relied on the fact that apparently this committee never had a view, and therefore there wasn't any consensus not to do something. Then I'm happy that the committee tries to express a consensus that, rightly or wrongly, around the arguments, the timeliness of it, to me, even if you agree with him, is pretty fundamental to how this process has been conducted. So if it's around the timeliness, then I'm happy that the committee would express a view, and that we can do that by corresponding with the Executive in respect of that.
You could have a view that there should be a change. You could have that view, theoretically, and you agree with the merits of that change. But it's the way the whole matter has been conducted, I think, is...
But I think that Alban's right. I mean, people may well take that view. My view is that the time to do it is not when there is a pending position to be filled of the Chief Constable.
Yeah, it's too
It's in a
controversial.
close season when you don't have a transfer window, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, that's right.
You know,
Yeah.
and because that draws attention to it and potentially undermines the process and the confidence in the process. And it's all, in my view, the timing of the whole thing is the thing that completely, potentially, can undermine the recruitment process and confidence in the police.
Okay, well
On the
then,
basis of the evidence we got today, the closed season, we might have got to 12:15, but we weren't at midnight.
well, to try and get committee consensus as far as possible, and that may not be 100% achievable, is that members content. This committee will write to the Executive, its ministers, indicating we believe the current status quo is retained because of the inappropriate nature of making any changes at this point, and therefore we would ask the Executive to take on board the committee's views in respect of that position. Does anyone want to indicate their discontent with the committee, at least for the purpose? So the rest of the members are content. We will convey that view to the Executive. Okay. Thank you, members. There isn't a section for any other business, so thank you. And the Policing Board, but we'll write to both conveying the Justice Committee's opinion. Adjourned.